We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to After America from the Australia Institute. I'm Dr Emma Shortis. I'm Senior Researcher in International and Security Affairs. Last week, we saw the last debate of this US election cycle. Republican vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance has been widely considered the winner. And he was, but not because he was a slightly smoother debater than his Democratic opponent Tim Walz. Vance won, I think, because he so successfully remodelled himself in real time.
We have the greatest country, the most beautiful country, the most incredible people anywhere in the world. But they're not going to be able to achieve their full dreams with the broken leadership that we have in Washington.
Kamala Harris is bringing us a new way forward. She's bringing us a politics of joy. She's bringing real solutions for the middle class, and she's centering you at the heart of that.
And whether you vote for me or vote for Tim Walz, I just want to say I'm so proud to be doing this, and I'm rooting for you. God bless you, and good night.
Going into the debate, Vance had been widely understood as a kind of woman-hating, far-right attack dog. But instead, he presented an image of a calm, reasonable, common-sense kind of guy. He was so polite. And that's what Vance does best, and why Trump picked him in the first place. He's a master of sanitising right-wing radicalism. On this episode of After America, we're going to pick up on where that vice presidential debate actually started, with a pretty bizarre question about whether either candidate would support an Israeli preemptive strike on Iran. As the situation in the Middle East becomes ever more dangerous, we wanted to look at how it got to this point, and in particular why the Biden administration appears to be so helpless. To help us understand where the United States might be headed, we're really pleased to welcome back my good friend Allan Behm. Allan is the Director of the International and Security Affairs program here at the Australia Institute. He has immense experience in government and foreign affairs. Before joining the Australia Institute, Allan spent nearly 3 decades in the Australian Public Service. He was Chief of Staff to the Minister for Climate Change and Industry, Greg Combet, and Senior Advisor to the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, Senator Penny Wong, between 2017 and 2019. He's the author of several books, including No Minister, which was published in 2015, and No Enemies, No Friends, which was published in 2022 by Upswell. His latest book, The Odd Couple, The Australia-America Relationship, was published earlier this year, and he's in fact just returned from a trip to the United States talking about that book. Here's Allan. Allan, welcome back to After America. It's lovely to have you on again.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emma. It's always nice to talk to you.
Thank you, Allan. Now, it is for you really, I suppose, after America, given that you've just very recently gotten back from a trip to the United States. So I thought I would start just by asking you, what was it like being on the ground in the United States about, 6 weeks out from an election?
Well, Emma, I, in my previous life, have been a very frequent visitor to the United States. And going back now for the first time in 2 decades was really very surprising. The United States is still the same country that I was visiting so frequently previously. It's a country of enormous energy, enormous possibility, enormous wealth, enormous disparity, enormous everything. It's just an enormous country. And although I spent my time only in Los Angeles and in Washington, I thought that Washington in particular did look different from when I saw it last time. It's got more big buildings. It's been curated much better. It looks like the capital of the free world, which it boasts itself to be. And yet I detected a number of undercurrents that I find pretty worrying. Amongst the people to whom I was talking, and I wasn't talking to a broad cross-section of the community. I was talking only to people at Georgetown University and in a few think tanks and a few other people connected with both the Pentagon and the State Department. So hardly a representative cross-section of America, but an influential one. And amongst all of them, I detected a kind of helplessness, a sense that what was happening in America was beyond their power to do very much about. They felt caught in a kind of tide of history. Those who were confident said that they were treading water, and those who weren't so confident were saying, well, they feel as though they're almost drowning. And so what I felt in the very sort of narrow keyhole through which I was looking at the United States was of a country that was in some respects confused, in some respects cynical, which is what you do when you say, well, whatever we do, it'll be the same and nothing will happen. That's the ultimate expression of cynicism. And for others, it was sort of as though they were catatonic, just totally caught in the headlights of events and unable to move, sort of stuck. And that is deeply worrying because the contest that is transacting at the moment is a critically important contest for the future of the United States. So I returned from the United States not pessimistic, Emma, but less optimistic than I usually am about the ability of the United States to supervene over the many sorts of problems that it's got to deal with, because these problems are internal ones, and I don't think that it's yet got the solutions to dealing with its internal problems because it can't use armed force, which is what it uses so often for the external ones.
It sure does. And I mean, Allan, that is particularly concerning because, as you say, the people that you were speaking to are powerful and influential people who do have a great deal of agency in American politics. And if they're feeling that cynical and confused, I suppose, about the domestic politics of the United States, of course, that has significant implications for the foreign policy of the United States and the role of the US in the world. So how were they thinking about and talking to you about the United States' role in the world, about American power and how they see the future of American power? Does it have the same kind of cynicism and hopelessness?
Sort of yes and no, I think, Emma. Many of them don't know where to turn. What was interesting to me is that here I'm just a thinker who comes from a think tank in Australia. I'm not inexperienced, but I'm no great sort of influencer with respect to US policy. And yet they're prepared to sort of think about some of the ideas that I put in the book that I was trying to talk to them about, The Odd Couple, about how the United States could do well to listen to its friends. Because we do have ideas. Australia and Australians have been successful, more or less, in managing the evolution of our own society. Of course, we could have done it much better, but we're not doing it too badly. And we have political processes that we can be truly proud of, dating back to pre-federation. So what I discovered was quite a lot of people who were interested to hear another view, but particularly a view such as you and I have, that is a hopeful view, even though we may not always match our optimism to our hope. And so I found that openness amongst the people to whom I was talking rather refreshing, actually, because it means that for those of us who are deeply invested in the future of the United States, there may be this window through which we can, in a quiet way, help them deal with their problems.
Mm. It sounds to me, though, is that reflective of a great loss of confidence in those influential circles that you were moving in? Because it is, I think you were kind of hinting at, Allan, that it is somewhat unusual for people in those circles to be that open and to not be confident in their own convictions and confident in the inherent goodness of American power. Is there a lack of confidence there, do you think?
I think there is. Mm-hmm. And yet it's not evenly distributed, Emma, I think. And you must have had the same experience when you were there not long ago. And it'll be interesting to see whether it's backed up when you're next there, perhaps at the time of the election. I drew much more hope from the young generation to whom I was talking at Georgetown University in the middle of the week that I was there. the young students, these are mostly people doing their master's degrees. There were a lot of them in the room. And of course, the other people in the room were members of the faculty and just other interested people. And the sorts of conversation that I had with those students was about, well, there are things that we can do. We can be inclusive. The interesting thing to me was how many of those students were from any number of different ethnic backgrounds, for example. And yet we know that the ethnic divides in America are very deep and very profound. And yet these young people, perhaps in their late 20s, mid-20s, didn't seem to be that preoccupied with that problem, but more idealistic perhaps, that they had the tools to deal with it in the future. Now, if that energy can be liberated in the United States, that is the solution actually to its long-term problems.
But liberating it is going to be very difficult, I imagine, in these current circumstances.
And that's the political task of the new president.
Whoever that might be, which is a scary prospect to think about, the kind of leadership that one potential president in particular might elevate. But let's try and get into that question a little bit more, the question of American leadership, because part of Joe Biden's promise in 2020 was that he would restore American leadership. You know, he would restore the United States to its rightful place in the world. And there has been, it's probably quite an understatement to be, there's been significant disappointment with the Biden administration and the leadership that it has exercised in the world after what many American analysts in particular would have seen as quite a positive first 2 years in terms of global leadership. The final 2 years have been a great disappointment, not the least because of the Biden administration's continued support of Israel. So given the significance of that situation, perhaps even before we start talking about American leadership, given that it is so complicated and so dangerous, are you able to give us, I know it's not easy in a short podcast, but to just explain briefly to listeners the context for what is happening in the Middle East and what is happening right now and why it is so dangerous?
Well, you're quite right in saying that the first 2 years of the Biden administration were pretty good because they were deeply focused on restabilising the US economy and dealing with the many claims that Trump had made during his presidency about the failure of the US economy. I mean, I had to be struck, Emma, by an interesting contradiction in the United States, where in California, everybody just about seems to be driving these huge two-door utes around on their massive freeways. And in Washington, people are driving electric vehicles, as well as the two-door utes, none of which are manufactured in the United States, least of all in Detroit. So that the idea that we make America great again by going back to the past clearly is not the way America is going to restore or transform, perhaps, the greatness it once had into the sort of greatness which is still its potential. The second 2 years of the Biden administration have been deeply compromised, I think, by matters that fall outside their control, but over which they clearly have influence and are deeply influenced themselves. And that clearly is Ukraine on the one hand with Putin and what has happened in the Middle East. Now, where we are today is about to recognise the first anniversary of the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October last year. And that has precipitated a catastrophic disaster in the Middle East. The situation in Palestine is a calamity, and it is now spreading to Lebanon. We have now got engagement, not just interest, but engagement from Iran. And the total environment of the Middle East is galloping away from any ability of anybody really to control it. It is an extremely complicated situation because it's not just a reflex of what happened a year ago, dangerous and stunning though that was. Its causes go back well over a century of interventions and actions and occurrences in the Middle East that have led to a situation where Israel believes that it is absolutely secure and that the United States will never let it fail. And it acts on that belief all the time. So it's able to do things which no other country in the Middle East can do because it ultimately can't be sanctioned for it. And that's part of the problem that Israel's got. And there are warning voices in Israel itself, not least of all amongst the generals who are actually fighting this war, that Israel needs to be very, very careful about what can be precipitated coming out of the very dramatic military actions that it's undertaking. And then you've got on the Palestinian side, the constant picture of, moving on now to 40,000 dead people that we know of in Palestine. And that doesn't count the people who are buried under rubble and who've been incinerated and everything else. Nobody knows what the real number is, but it must exceed 40,000 by a large number.
Yeah,
so we've got that on the other hand. And the policy challenge that we're trying to deal with is to steer between the humanitarian calamity of Palestine and the strategic security issue of Israel. And in my view, those two positions are not reconcilable. You cannot bring them together and reconcile them. And that, I think, is the fundamental problem that is confronting the United States as the mediator, as it were, of the current calamity in the Middle East. It's an intractable problem for Biden now and for Blinken, and they cannot see a way through.
And I wonder as well, Allan, you mentioned Iran, which of course has been a great focus in the United States in particular, given the history of that relationship and particularly a long-held neoconservative desire to win back Iran after it was lost, I suppose, quote unquote, lost in 1979. But I suppose the impunity of Israel that you explained there is leading to this very dangerous situation where there is increasing provocation of Iran kind of being barracked on in the United States, to the point where the opening question of the vice presidential debate this week was about whether candidates would support a preemptive strike by Israel on Iran. That's the level of craziness of the way that Iran is talked about in the United States.
If you were the final voice in the Situation Room, would you support or oppose a preemptive strike by Israel on Iran?
What's fundamental here is that steady leadership is going to matter. It's clear, and the world saw it on that debate stage a few weeks ago. A nearly 80-year-old Donald Trump talking about crowd sizes is not what we need in this moment.
Donald Trump actually delivered stability in the world, and he did it by establishing effective deterrence. People were afraid of stepping out of line.
His chief of staff, John Kelly, said that he was the most flawed human being he'd ever met. And both of his secretaries of defense and his national security advisors said he should be nowhere near the White House.
Now, you asked about a preemptive strike, Margaret, and I want to answer the question. Look, it is up to Israel what they think they need to do to keep their country safe, and we should support our allies wherever they are when they're fighting the bad guys. I think that's the right approach to take with the Israel question.
So what do you see happening there with Iran and the Biden administration, particularly in the next couple of months, and how dangerous do you think that situation is?
Look, I think the danger of US miscalculation is high. I think we should recognise that American-Iranian policy has been a disaster since 1953. That the interference in Iran at the time of Mossadegh was the beginning, I think, of, essentially 80 years now of disastrous relationship between the United States and a very significant Middle Eastern power with enormous cultural influence. The abortive rescue attempt in 1979, that was a significant disaster for the United States. And ultimately, of course, the hostages were released. But the United States has never been able to restore anything like a workable relationship with Iran that it has been able to restore with other former enemies, such as Vietnam, where it now has a very interesting and quite a stable relationship. And I think the reason for that, Emma, is that the United States has constantly miscalculated what kind of polity and what kind of strategic entity Iran really is. It's too easy, I think, for people who don't, for example, speak Farsi, to look at the religious leaders of Iran and just assume that they're all religious maniacs and hide behind a set of unhelpful myths to deal with a country that actually has deep reservoirs of learning, deep reservoirs of cultural strength and enormous cultural resistance. And that goes back 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years. Now, until the United States is able to recalibrate its way of dealing with an entity like Iran, it will be caught up with people who think that an Israeli preemptive strike is okay. And that, I think, would trigger, even more than perhaps anything else, the collapse of the Middle East into all-out conflict.
Which is a very frightening thought, isn't it?
It is.
If we go back to the original question, because I derailed us a little bit about American leadership, what do you think inspired and rejuvenated American leadership might look like in that region? You mentioned earlier that, the Biden administration seems paralyzed. It seems unable to see a way out of what is happening. But of course, there are ways out. To suggest that there aren't is deeply cynical and wrong. Of course, there are ways out of conflict. This kind of conflict is not inevitable, and it's not inevitable that it should continue. So how might the United States begin to navigate a path or lead a pathway out of this conflict? Is that possible, do you think?
Oh, I'm certain it's possible. The question is, how does the United States balance its public diplomacy, and it's always expected to have something to say, with its private diplomacy? Because in this case, the United States does need to embark on some really serious private diplomacy. And the United States has got a good track record, actually, in the conduct of private diplomacy. I suggest that perhaps where they might want to start is a serious conversation with the government of Israel. It is not in the strategic interests of either Israel or the United States for there to be an assumption that, come what may, the United States will effectively condone misadventure on the part of Israel. The United States has got to make clear that it too has boundaries, and that there are boundaries that it won't cross. It's good at setting boundaries that other people may not cross. Sometimes it doesn't enforce them very well. Just ask President Obama about that. But the fact is that it can set its own boundaries and say, our friends and allies cannot go down this path. And that has got to be part of a very private diplomacy, because if it's a public diplomacy, it will look like a threat. Whereas in fact, what it actually is the United States clarifying what its own strategic interests are and its expectations of those interests to be as much respected by Israel as Israel anticipates the United States would respect Israel's strategic interests. And I don't think that balance is there at the moment. So first of all, there'd have to be that private diplomacy with Israel, and there would need to be a set of other private diplomacies. We hide behind the fiction that we can never negotiate with terrorists. Well, the fact of the matter is that we do. So the United States, all the time, the United States has got to find a way of being able to talk to Hamas on the one hand and Hezbollah on the other. And the vehicle and the route to that is not just in Qatar and the Gulf states, but Iran is a critical element in that. Because it's in Iran's interest that this problem is resolved too. So that's why the private diplomacy, I think, has got to be a critical starting point. And that is the business not of the CIA or the Pentagon, that is the business of the State Department, and the State Department and the Secretary of State have got to be empowered to do that. And that's a big task for an incoming president, whether it is President Trump or whether it's Kamala Harris. The public diplomacy is equally important. because the president has got to release power to the Secretary of State to get on with the business of being able to talk to the international community, not to reveal that the United States is impotent, which is what we're seeing at the moment, but to be able to indicate how the United States is able to represent the interests of the concerned international community, because none of us want war in the Middle East, because it'll affect all of us. And particularly when at least one of the belligerents, Israel, has got nuclear weapons. So the diplomatic task for the United States is enormous, but I strongly consider that the United States is well up to that.
You mentioned there, Alan, whether it's a President Trump or a President Harris, and those are two very different pathways. So to bring it back, I suppose, to that contest, there's a tendency, in all election coverage, of course, to think that we'll have an answer on the 6th of November. We'll have an answer about which path the United States is taking, and we'll have a kind of resolution to the question. But of course, that's fairly unlikely, I think. We had Don Watson on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and when we were discussing this question, he made this, what I thought was a really, unsurprisingly, because it was Don Watson, an incredibly profound insight where he basically said the question is not what the United States looks like on the 6th of November, but what it looks like this time next year. So it's a very unfair question, but what do you think about what the United States looks like a year from now, and whether they can build the kind of inspired leadership that we've been talking about, and I suppose what might happen if they don't?
Well, it's a very difficult question, and it's one that puzzles all of us, Emma. I think it's a very fair question. It's simply I can't answer it, and nor can anybody else at this point. But I think we can say a couple of things about what the answer might look like. Irrespective of what happens, whether it is a Harris victory or a Trump victory, there is likely, I think, to be a measure of domestic political turmoil in the immediate aftermath of November the 5th. If Kamala Harris is returned, I suspect there will be violence in the United States, and that could take some time to deal with. So that even in a year's time, the United States may continue to consider what the hell is happening here, that we can't even come to a conclusion of an election. After all, we've had this before. Al Gore didn't win the presidency, and we didn't all go and clobber each other. So they'll be thinking a lot about that, and so they should. If Trump wins, I think in a year's time, it will be more of the same, with one quite big difference. I think Trump will sanction Israel's provocations and make it much clearer to Israel that its freedom of action to do whatever it feels like doing is rather more limited under a Trump presidency. We have seen how Trump handled NATO, which was pretty brutal, really. And I don't think that Trump is going to really condone United States being manoeuvred into a position of having to put troops on the ground in the Middle East. I just don't think Trump will do that. If Kamala Harris wins, I think we look at an altogether different sort of future evolving over the term of her presidency. The fundamental difference to me, Emma, between the two is that Kamala Harris has respect for the governmental institutions of the United States. And I think that the first thing that we're going to see, sort of implicitly really, she's not going to sort of get a brass band and announce it, but we'll see that she'll start using the traditional instruments of American power, but particularly the State Department, the Commerce Department, the capacity of the Treasury, of the Justice Department to manage the internal and external affairs of the United States in the terms of the procedures that the United States has established constitutionally, really since 1776. Trump doesn't respect those, and for that reason, he's much more freewheeling. So if Harris wins, I think in a year's time, we will see a United States different from the one we've got now, but a United States with which we are, I think, more familiar. If Trump wins, we'll see a United States that we became familiar with during his presidency, but with a few additional sort of, whether they're decorations or blemishes, Emma, I'm not sure, but a few extra bits on it. And I think one of the bits may well be a somewhat more definite and more constrained foreign policy, which will limit the agency of external actors to act in ways that are not in the interests of the Trump presidency. That's the best I can do at the moment, Emma. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. And I think as we've discussed many times before, there's still a lot to be done here in Australia about how we might navigate either of those outcomes. But unfortunately, that will have to be a conversation for another time. We appreciate your time, Allan Behm, so very much. So thank you again for joining us on After America.
An honour, Emma.
This episode of After America was recorded on Friday, the 4th of October, and no doubt a lot will have changed since then. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd be really grateful if you could subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. You can reach out to us with feedback and episode or guest ideas via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Twitter @the Oz Institute. That's with an AUS. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. We'll be back next Tuesday. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.